How's it going? I'm really excited to be here. I've been to this a couple of times. It's always a lot of fun. I want to point out, was it table 10 and 11 over here? You guys, you brought the little man with you. You saw the flyers like, oh, biology is superheroes. This is going to be adorable. And then they showed up, and you've grown up fast tonight, but got like cadavers and all sorts of stuff. It's like a bar mitzvah. To start off, I want to ask a pretty simple question. What is science? When you guys think about science, what do you think about? Experiments, pursuit of knowledge, study of the material world. I like that. Anything else? Failure. Yeah. So you must be a scientist. This is typically what people think about when they think about science, like the very quantitative nature of it. But I would argue, like when I think about science as a scientist, I think of science as storytelling. And I think this is an underappreciated part of the scientific process. And mostly because, like, if you walk up to a scientist and you ask them, especially a biologist, I'm a biologist, an evolutionary biologist, and you ask them exactly, like, how did you get into science? What you will never hear is like, man, when I was a kid, I was just really into statistical significance. Like, that was my jam. It's never gonna happen. Typically what you hear is like a cute story about, when I was a kid, I went on a walk through the forest and I saw this thing, or I was splashing in a tide pool and I experienced this thing. And it's that story that really gets people into the process of science, right? And it sends them down, it's an adventure, right? It sends them down an exploratory journey where, they encounter a bunch of different questions and they seek to answer those questions in whatever way, right? And that to me is science. But of course, those stories are not the same for everyone. Everyone has a different story. For me, for instance, like I never did the woods thing. I never did like splashing around in a tide pool thing, mostly because I was raised in the hood and wasn't into that stuff. But what I did have was television, and that was great, and that was sort of where I got introduced to nature. Like Mutual Omaha's Wild Kingdom and all this sort of stuff. Like that's how I got, into nature. But really, one of the things that introduced me to science, strangely enough, was comic books. You remember like Fox Kids and the Spider-Man cartoon that used to come on? That was my jam. And that's how I got into science, right? So seeing Peter Parker as an individual, high school kid doing this thing, like always kind of getting beat up, getting bullied. Then he gets into this accident, becomes a superhero. And he could have left it at that. It's like, oh man, I got superpowers now. I'm super strong. I got my spidey sense. I'm gonna mess some people up now. I wish those bullies would. But he didn't do that. He decided that he was gonna be a superhero. And he didn't just stop at the powers that he was given from this accident. He took it a step further and used his scientific acumen to become something more, right? He used it to, engineer these spider webs that he uses, right? And this is a really critical part of who we think of, when we think of him as a character and as a hero. So it's like these sorts of stories that really got me into science when I was a kid. And now I'm an evolutionary biologist, right? And these stories, when we're talking about stories, they play a lot of different roles, both in our everyday lives, obviously, but also in science, right? And mostly through the lens of a thought experiment, right? So thought experiments are a way of taking, complex, abstract information or complex information and sort of using an abstract means of sort of distilling and trying to understand that super complex data or a hypothesis. And I think the most famous is Schrodinger's cat. You guys know Schrodinger's cat? Has anybody never heard of Schrodinger's cat? Nobody's gonna judge you. Okay, you haven't heard of Schrodinger's cat. Basically, my man Erwin Schrodinger basically proposed this experiment to understand this idea of quantum superposition by proposing this like weird zombie cat. Basically saying that if you're in a situation where you have an unknown, right? So for instance, a cat in a box, right? And you imagine that there's a poison in that box that's going to break in at some unknown time. You can simultaneously think of that cat as both alive and dead until you open the box and actually observe it, and then it sort of condenses onto a reality. And this is the way that he went about teaching about quantum superposition, which is like this sort of reality space of all particles in the universe. But when we're thinking about these thought experiments, they allow us a lot of different opportunities to take something abstract. Like there's no zombie cat, right? If you put a cat in a box, give it a couple minutes and the smell will tell you whether or not the cat is alive or dead, right? You don't need a whole lot of physics to figure that out, but it's useful, right? And that's the point of a thought experiment. It's something abstract but useful. Typically I use I use thought experiments in my work, like obviously in my research, but I also try to take odd thought experiments to teach about about aspects of biology that I think can be hard to interpret sometimes. So for instance, today we're going to go on a thought experiment, and I'm going to use some of the lore from comic books as a way of exploring aspects of biology. So typically in my research, I study reptiles. And reptiles are really cool for a lot of different reasons. And I think actually comic books allow us a really interesting means to understand some of the hardcore biology that reptiles and amphibians and fish use to eke out an existence in very odd ways. So in order to do this, I'm going to introduce you to a superhero, Wonder Woman, right? In the island of the Amazons. Wonder Woman is Trey dope for a lot of reasons. She's obviously, she's one of the most powerful characters in the DC universe, but she's also, a feminist icon. So before I get into this, I also want to say, I realize that it's weird for me to be talking about, Wonder Woman and the island of the Amazons and this feminist icon when this entire thing is full of dudes. I readily recognize that, and question and answer comes, ladies, if you have any qualms, please call me out, because I realize that, talking about this, regardless, I'm still a dude and I still live behind, a veil of ignorance. So if you see something problematic, please call me out. Okay, so we're going in. So when we're thinking about, Wonder Woman and the island of the Amazons, first, we have this island of, immortal warrior-like women, and their princess, Diana. And according to lore, Diana was not born, so to speak. She was molded from clay, molded by her mother, Hippolyta. And so when we're thinking about this island of the Amazons, is there anything that we can go to really sort of understand exactly what this lore means biologically? So if we're thinking about Hippolyta molding a daughter from clay, right, and each woman being immortal, in the biological world, to me, right, as a biologist, this, to me, speaks to, the asexual reproduction, right? So things like parthenogenesis. Right, when we're thinking about asexual reproduction, right, this may be a means of explaining, a mother molding a daughter from clay with no input from another individual, being immortal in terms of raising that offspring that has 100% of her genetic material, and in that in itself being a type of rebirth, and through that means like perpetuating oneself generation after generation. And this is something that's really prevalent across the tree of life. There are about 80 species of reptiles, amphibians, and fishes. These are just the vertebrates that go through asexual reproduction. And the simplest form is called parthenogenesis. And in this case, you have a female that lays an egg that has all of her chromosomes in all of the copies that it exists in her. And then that egg essentially just spontaneously becomes another female, right? A clone of the original. And so when we're thinking about this as a potential viable way for life to play out on the island of Themyscira, we also immediately come into some issues, right? In the sense that, So first, I should say that this is something that happens not only in asexual species, but some sexual species have actually figured this out as well, right? So in captivity, there are species of sharks and Komodo dragons that under normal circumstances would reproduce by mating with a male. In captivity, they've spontaneously reproduced clones of themselves. But we also see this in the wild in snakes like copperheads and cottonmouths. But if we're thinking about clones, right, we immediately run into this problem in that Diana and her mother, Hippolyta, don't actually look anything alike. If she was a clone, we would expect these two to look alike, right? So that could potentially be a problem for this hypothesis. If we dig a little bit deeper into the lore, we run into a bigger problem in the sense that, we also know that Hippolyta got it on with Zeus, right? And, that's, if you're gonna be asexual, that's not the way to do it, right? So does this affect our theory? Well, not necessarily, right? Because there are a lot of different ways to be asexual. And so one of the most extreme and I think most interesting is what's called hybridogenesis, right? And this is a little bit complicated, but I'm gonna break it down for you. So in hybridogenesis, essentially you have a female that produces eggs with only one copy of each chromosome, right? That's what we do, right, as a sexual species, right? And that egg has to be fertilized by the sperm of a male of another species, right? And again, that sounds pretty similar to what we do, right? There has to be a sperm and an egg. But that offspring has both mom and dad's genes in most of their cells, right? So they can look like a mixture of their mom and their dad, much like we do, but not in their eggs, not in their reproductive cells. So what this means is that when that daughter reproduces, she only passes on her mom's DNA, right? Her dad's DNA never makes it into the next generation. So this is still asexual reproduction. Some of the ladies are just like, this is some smart ass frogs. Right? So there are a lot of different ways to do this. And a lot of times this asexual reproduction is the result of hybrid speciation, right? In which case, you have two separate species, right? Biological species that under some odd circumstances actually come together and are able to form a viable hybrid. And that hybrid, being asexual, and typically has a different complement of chromosomes, right? So we're diploid, a lot of vertebrates are diploid, but in a lot of these hybrid speciation events, you actually get a triploid hybrid, which means that they can no longer breed with any of the parental species. That's immediate speciation. So when we're talking about, if we're thinking about the island of Themyscira, we can think of, like the gods, for instance, like Zeus, as one species and us as humans as a different species. Maybe sometime in the ancient history of this DC universe, they actually came together, formed a hybrid that was asexual, and that led to this island of Themyscira, these Amazons. Right? But of course, there's a lot more that we have to explain when it comes to Diana and these island of the Amazons. The fact that, one, they're gargantuan, and two, they kick much ass, right? When we think about our species, men on average, American men on average are about 5'9", women on average are 5'3". I got some argument from my partner that I think they're like 5'5". So, okay, we'll come to a compromise and say 5'4". How's that? Is it? That's what relationships are all about. But when we consider Wonder Woman, she's somewhere between 6 foot and 6'3". She's a very big human being. And not only that, but she's bigger than everyone. She's faster than everyone. She's stronger than everyone. She's more resilient than any human could ever hope to be. Has greater endurance than any normal human. So if we're thinking about this biology, is there anything that we can go to in the real world that actually explains this? Well, yeah. And that's this idea of hybridization and hybrid speciation, right? So we consider this genus of whiptail lizards. The genus is called Aspidicilus. And there are some species, Aspidicilus neomexicanus, as a representative, that are the result of a hybridization event of two sexual species. Now, the male of A. tigris is a very large species. Right? And at some point it mated with a pretty small species named Inornatus, and they produced this asexual female lineage. And as you can see, right, the asexual females are actually much larger than the males of the smaller species. Now, again, if we're thinking about gods mating with humans, producing this hybrid lineage of very large, athletically gifted females, this, again, makes sense. We can go to the natural world to pull, some grounding for this. But not only is she bigger, right? Diana is also, she does a lot of things that most humans can't do, right? She has greater endurance, she has greater strength, she has greater reflexes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And size doesn't really make the difference, right? Is there any evidence that there's actually increased performance in these hybrids? And the answer is yes, right? And this is a general trend that's known as heterosis or hybrid vigor, right? It's like the physical, quantitatively, the physical superiority of hybrids over non-hybrid ancestors, right? For instance, this genus of geckos known as Heteronodia, there are several different species. Some are asexual, some are sexual. And there was a series of experiments done looking at the performance of asexual females in these asexual species with males of closely related sexual species, right? And they found that when given extreme conditions, right, those hybrid females had greater locomotor endurance, even at extreme temperatures, that they had higher maximum metabolic output than their sexual counterparts, and they also had greater endurance at higher speeds, right? So for all quantitative purposes, right, these asexual, all-female lineages are physically superior. They're able to do things that their sexual ancestors just could not do. So then that begs the question, why do we have sex at all? Why? All right, so now we're having the sex talk. I'm growing up real fast, bud. Yes, it's fun. It's fun. But why do we have sex? And the answer is because, in an evolutionary sense, the answer is because of mutations, right? So mutations mostly are deleterious. They're bad for us, right? There's a lot of different ways to break a clock. Anytime something spontaneously pops up in our genomes, it is typically bad. And sex essentially allows us to control over evolutionary time how bad those mutations are. All right, and this is typically called Mullers Ratchet. So essentially what happens, if we think about in a sexual species, we have different chromosomes, right? And mutations pop up randomly on those chromosomes. And through sex, we do what's called recombination, where we can switch out, different parts of chromosomes with each other, right? And this is like crossing over. And because of that process, right, if you have, two mutations that are in two different places on complementary chromosomes, right, crossing over can actually allow that ratchet to click back, right? So that you have at least one chromosome that can purge itself of deleterious mutations every once in a while, right? And this at a population level allows for some level of control. But in an asexual species, right, that ratchet is irreversible. Once it clicks, it can't click back because there's no recombination through sex. So what does this mean for our island of the Amazons? Like, does this spell disaster? Well, you could think of it that way, or you could think of it in a slightly different way. So not only does this Mullers ratchet apply to asexual species, but it also applies to those regions of our chromosomes, or those regions of our genome that also don't recombine. Things like the Y chromosome, right? Those things that make us male fellas. And there is actual evidence that our Y chromosome is deteriorating, right? Generation after generation, it's deteriorating. So if we take that into account, when we consider, again, the island of the Amazons, really what we may be looking at is the future of the human race. In a really real way, the future may be female. So if we're thinking about thought experiments, these sorts of stories, they provide fodder for understanding, really interesting aspects of the biological world, right? So, all the weird ways that biology goes about perpetuating itself. If we think about, any sort of, application, like where would science be without these stories, right? For instance, if we think about NASA, right, founded in 1958, where would it be without these stories in the 1930s of Flash Gordon exploring space and going on these crazy adventures? But at the same time, what about the reverse? Like, where would these stories be without science? Like, where would my man Bruce Banner be as the Hulk if it wasn't for the Manhattan Project. So these things feed each other, and they provide, really important mechanisms for furthering both our ability to tell stories, but also our ability to do science in a very real way. And also it furthers our ability to come to conclusions that we might not be able to find otherwise if it wasn't for these imaginative ways of exploring quantitative data. And it's because of that the stories we tell, it's really important who gets represented and who is telling those stories. So for me, it was Peter Parker as Spider-Man, that was one of the major foundations of why I became a scientist. But for, a lot of kids out there, like maybe it will be Miles Morales, this, young Afro-Latino kid growing up in Brooklyn, who will be their Spider-Man that will allow them some point of connection, to see themselves in a hero. And we as a culture owe it to ourselves, to tell stories that allow multiple individuals, to see those points of connection, see themselves as a hero, see themselves as a scientist, because you really never know where the next superhero is gonna come from. Thanks.